Now that we've got a basic understanding about Mocha for testing, we're going to create some unit tests for our API endpoints. Before we begin, let's discuss an important concept, which is the idea of a unit in unit testing. So a unit is a small testable part of our application. Typically this will be a function, like it was in the demo test that we just wrote. But the unit could also be a class or perhaps a group of functions that operate together. For our API, we're going to consider the unit to be a single API endpoint. For example, post items. Now one endpoint will usually consist of a group of functions like the route, the controller, the model, and so on. And you could definitely write unit tests for those atomic parts, but I think that would be too much effort for too little reward in the case of this application. The other thing that's important to be clear on is the inputs and outputs of the unit. So a meaningful unit test will be one where for a given set of inputs you get a consistent output or outputs. In the case of a function, that's very easy to conceptualize as it's the arguments and the return. Like when we passed in 2 and 3 into our add function, we expected a return of 5, right? So with clear inputs and outputs, the unit test becomes easy to understand and very obviously useful. Now in the case of our API endpoints, the input will be a request to the endpoint. So for example, we'll begin a test by creating a post request to items. Now this input can also include the post body, headers, cookies, and so on. The output of our test will be the response from the API. And that can also be broken down into several things like the response body, the HTTP status, and again the headers and cookies and so on. Now it's also important to consider that an input and output of API tests can include the database state. Now this is particularly important if our endpoint initiates a create, update, or delete operation. Now in these cases, we might want to actually assert the database state before and after a response is received. So all that might seem fairly complicated and like a lot of information, but I think you'll see that in practice, this is all fairly simple and logical to implement.